Hello everyone and welcome to the Hobby Guard. In today's video we will be talking about the Space Wolves and why indeed they are not Grimdark at all. Now that is why I am today wearing my Barbarian helmet, but I will also be drawing while I yap endlessly about my complaints on the bad writing of the Space Wolves of Warhammer 40,000 and how, in my humble opinion, to fix them. While I do that, I will also be drawing my fan art here of the same old fan art that I've been drawing for a year now, pretty much. Where is it? This one right here. So I might have to switch my Barbarian helmet for my good old wizard hat because this does not allow me to see properly, so please bear with me while I yap. With that being said, welcome to the Hobby Garden. Let's begin. Alright, thank you for bearing with me while I switch my attire from the Barbarian to the Wizard. See, I thought because of the theme of the video that we will be covering today, I thought it was gonna be a fun idea to wear my Barbarian helmet. I did not think about how hard it would be to move my hand around and draw while I have it on. But anyways, so some people, obviously the Space Wolves as a Space Marine chapter have a bunch of fans. It is certainly one of the most famous Space Marine chapters. And it also has a lot of critics in terms of the lore. Now, other YouTube channels, like one of my favorites, Northern Exile, has talked at depth about why the Space Wolves are not a very logical chapter, a very appealing chapter. And he also comments on like the typical trope of your typical Space Wolves fan. I won't get too much into that because those videos are already made. I will, however, share my own take of why I don't think the Space Wolves are an interesting chapter. In fact, why I despise them almost, not every time, but almost every time that they showed up in the lore. I rolled my eyes all the way to the back of my head. Indeed, I have read some Space Wolf exclusive books, or at least Space Wolf centric books, and they were some of the hardest reads in all of the dozens and dozens of Warhammer books that I have read to get through. It was painful. Namely, I read the one called The Wolf Time, which, by the way, is like the biggest scam, because obviously the Wolf Time has a very strict connotation in the lore of Warhammer, where Slim and Ross said, "Oh, I will return in the Wolf Time," right? The Wolf Time is like Ragnarok for the Space Wolves. Now, what is, as I said, I will address my issue. I have many issues with the Space Wolves. I won't talk about the Space Wolves fans whatsoever. Again, those videos have already been made. I will not get into that. What are the issues, my issues, personal issues with the Space Wolves lore-wise? Well, in reality, as I said, there's many, but my biggest issue, and the one I would like to tackle today, is that they are not Grimdark. They are not a Grimdark faction. They read to me like a fantasy version of a Viking faction. You know how Vikings are a very, strictly speaking, like historically speaking, Vikings are a very particular thing. They are a group of people. Viking, in fact, is an action or a profession. To go Viking, it's like pirating or raiding, right? So the Vikings, so-called Vikings, are not like, oh, it's not the Viking culture, but I will refer to it as Viking culture because it's a, well, better known term. But basically we're referring to the Scandinavian peoples of the, I want to say somewhere between 700 AD and I think it is more or less well established that the end of the Viking Age was somewhere around 1000, let's say 1060 after Christ AD. I still call it after Christ because I speak High Gothic, and in High Gothic we still say after Christ. I don't know what it's supposed to mean now, like after the Common Era or something like that. Anyways, So yeah, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, if I recall correctly, at 1060 after Christ, and that is supposed to be the end of the so-called Viking Age. Now, the Vikings themselves, and their strict beliefs and modum of warfare, and their culture and their reason for existing, are a very very particular thing historically speaking. There is a ton of research, there are a ton of books, there is actually indeed a ton of disagreement on their lifestyle, their actual beliefs, but the point is they are a thing. Now, the fantasy Viking trope, the pop culture idea of the Viking, is something else entirely, much like the fantasy pop culture version of the samurai is something else entirely to what the samurai actually were. And oftentimes even the knight, even though I believe like the knight, I guess the fantasy trope of the knight is a bit closer, I suppose. But the Vikings, the fantasy trope of the Vikings is basically they are big, dumb barbarians. They wear horned helmets, they wear wolf pelts and bear pelts, and they love drinking and fighting, and they are silly. And you know, that breaks down into different categories. There's like obviously the grimdark fantasy, the dark fantasy aspect of that, where they are raiders and murderers. You know, the typical version of the heathen, the barbarian heathen in the Arthurian legends, for example. They are the bad guy, indeed. They are pagans and heathens and unscrupulous peoples who love violence. And then there is the cartoon version of the Viking where like, no, actually they were all good people. They sure love to fight, they sure love to drink, but you know, they're just big, old, silly, gentle giants. They are like, if you ever watched, what's it called, that thing from Critical Role? I didn't watch much of it, but they have like this animated show, Vox Machina. You know, the big barbarian in that one, I forget what his name is. Again, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I think the race is called like Goliath. So the big Goliath in that show, where he's like, yeah, he loves to fight and whatever and drink, but he's just like a good old big gentle giant. Deep within, he's just a nice guy. Well, the Space Wolves are that. Not even that. Like the Space Wolves are like a child version of that. And let me elaborate. Now, remember, I am going to fix the Space Wolves in this video. But first, before I quote-unquote fix the Space Wolves, I need to lay out my problems with the Space Wolves as they are represented. They are presented as like the noble savages, the noble savage trope, but they are incredibly, first of all, Mary Sue in the lore, whereas like they always win or very rarely take a loss at the very least. And then they are always contradicting the status quo, and then they are usually right about things. You know, they are contradicting the status quo, they are contradicting the general Imperium at large in their ways. They are kind of like very unique, they're special, they're their own people, they follow their own rules, they don't listen to the rest of the Imperium, and more often than not, they are right in their ways. Their way is the highway, so to speak. And there's nothing wrong with that concept as long as I would say the actual issue is that their ways are very different. They feel very out of place with the rest of the Imperium of Man, because again, I don't think they are actually a Grimdark faction. They are kind of like, we hear people say like how fearsome they are, and yet when push comes to shove, they don't really act fearsome. They don't really act much like Space Marines at all. They act like big, dumb, friendly barbarians, and not friendly perhaps to others, but friendly to the little man, to civilians. Now, the most common thing people will say about the Space Wolves is that they are sorry about that. One of two things. Either they are Vikings in space, or they are, as their name suggests, Space Wolves. Well, technically now they're called the Vulca according to themselves, but they are the Space Wolves, okay? I refuse to give them the respect and call them the Vulca. Shut up, dude. I'm sure the White Scars in Chogoris are called something else in Chogorian. And I'm sure the name White Scar sounds different in Chogorian. And I'm sure the name Dark Angel sounds different in Calibanite. And I'm sure the name Blood Angels is pronounced different in Baal. And so on and so on. And yet you don't have Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and White Scars correcting people every time they call them by their actual Emperor given name. Actually, it's actually the Volca Fenrica. Stop, okay? Space Wolves in the lore? You have to stop. No one cares, dude. Anyway, see, it's those little things that add up. They add up, man. But anyways. People will say like, oh yeah, if you have to elevator pitch the Space Wolves to someone, that is to explain to someone the Space Wolves in a sentence, they would say one of two things. Either they are Vikings in space, or they are Space Wolves, you know? They really like wolfy stuff. They are furries if you're into the memes. And my issue is, actually, they are neither of those things. They don't act like wolves. When they try to do it's extremely cringy and extremely weird. I remember reading this book that I was talking about, the Wolf Time, and that book is just a cringe fest. Okay, that's a cringe factory. It's cringe town in there. But in the Wolf Time, amongst many weird cringy things that happen, there is a part where the Space Wolves are described. I think it was like a squad of Space Wolf Terminators. And they are like elite Wolf Guard or whatever the hell they are called, the Wolf Special Flakes. They are communicating with each other via snarls and howls, and they have their own battle language. I forget what they call it in Warhammer. Their battle sign or language. And it's just snarls. They're literally like with their guns and their weapons. You know, they're clearing out these, I think it's like Space Hulk or something, filled with orcs. And they're to each other just like... And that is the cringiest thing I can think of in the world of Warhammer. Okay, that is absolutely ridiculous. It's like something out of like the Ninja Turtles, man. Which is fine if we're watching the Ninja Turtles and there is the porcupine dude that is arguing with the rhinoceros man, or maybe it was like a warthog dude, I don't know, and they talk like Okay, I used to do voice acting for shows like that, and it was a lot of fun. The issue is, it doesn't go very well in Warhammer to have grown-ass Space Marines howling and snarling at each other to communicate in the middle of a war zone or a hostile environment. Anyways, other than those exceptions, they don't really act much like wolves at all. And allow me to elaborate. Like wolves or Vikings, which is to me the most important aspect, okay? Because the whole animal gimmick, oh yes, this chapter is modeled after an animal, only takes you that far, because animals are cool. I like animals as much as the other guy. But they only take you, like, mimicking an animal with your character, it only takes your character so far in terms of their development and how interesting they are. The Carcarol and Astra are more interesting than the Space Wolves because they have more to them than just being sharks, you know? Sharks don't really hunt in packs. Sharks don't get along with other sharks, really. Sharks don't really form like alliances or do a bunch of things. And so the Carcharlan Astra don't have to pretend to be sharks. It's more like their culture is sharky, let's say. But again, that only takes you so far in terms of character development. It is great if you are 12 years old, which there's nothing wrong with that, and you are working on your Space Marine army, and you think, well, I like wolves. Wolves are big and scary. Or I like sharks. Sharks are big and scary. And that's why I like them. So literally, that's nothing wrong with that. But in a Grimdark universe, you also need one where like most of your fan base and consumer base are adults, grumpy old boomers like myself. You also have to consider writing books for adults, right? So in that way, you have to maybe get out of the big scary wolfy trope and do something cool with it. Now let's talk about the Viking aspect. I mentioned before how the Vikings were in fact a very specific thing. I am no history professor by any means, but I have read a lot on the Vikings back in my day, many years ago, I would say. So my memory, as you might have picked on already, on Viking history is very, very rusty, let's say. I don't know how to say it right now, but I don't exactly recall like the dates and the names or whatever, but I do have a lot of information floating around in my noggin about like what actually the Vikings were like, and it much depends on the period of time that we're talking about. But let's just embrace a general idea of the Vikings. Let's just talk about the general idea of the Vikings. They are first of all raiders, pirates. They often serve as bodyguards. Now, let's not make the mistake of thinking that Vikings were every Scandinavian peoples of the centuries that I described, of the dates that I described. Let's say like 7th to 10th century, I think that's how centuries work. Or 7th to 11th century, or 8th to 11th century. So the Scandinavian peoples were not all Vikings. Like, not all Scandinavian warriors actually were Vikings. To go Viking meant to go raiding, to get on a ship with your pals and go to a distant land or to a distant town and raid and pillage and many other things that I won't mention here because my channel is small enough as it is. I don't need to get punished by the machine god, by the machine spirit of YouTube for my choice of words. But let's just say Vikings were into doing very, very, very bad things, okay? So, amongst those things, Vikings loved slavery, they loved gratuitous murder, they loved ritualistic torture, and ritualistic sacrifice of humans and animals. That is not to, I shouldn't say they loved, but they practiced it. Things like self-mutilation as well, in the sense that like they would file their teeth and things like that, right? To be more scary. So in all those sorts of ways, Vikings were extremely hardcore. Vikings also were tradesmen. They would like trade. Actually, some people would say, depending on the period and the origin of said Vikings, they would more often come as tradesmen than as Vikings. They would more often come as, depending if they could, I don't want to say more often, but sometimes even they would come as settlers to a faraway land than Vikings. So not always Viking was like, again, for the Scandinavian peoples, Vikings wasn't always their first choice. To go Viking wasn't always the first choice. To go Viking, well, you go Viking for resources. You go Viking for riches. Now, the other thing that is often written about and that we have a lot of evidence for, was the so-called Viking mentality, or the so-called Viking culture of dying in battle, to be taken to either the Folkvanger or to Valhalla, either the Hall of Freya or the Hall of the Slain in the afterlife, either by Odin and his Valkyries or by Freya. I don't know. Again, I don't remember all the exact details, but they did have this huge culture existing around the idea of for a warrior, if you're a warrior in this lifetime, you want to be a warrior in the afterlife. Otherwise, you go to the lame afterlife, to the normie NPC afterlife, where you just are lame in the afterlife. No, you want to become a big badass warrior even after you are gone. So you want to go to Valhalla, right? So they did have this culture of seeking glory in battle. But by all accounts, really. What they were not was mindless barbarians. Not at all. They were more often than not extremely cunning people, extremely adept at fighting. Fighting in choosing the right conditions to fight, let's say. There are many examples of Vikings losing, like when faced with properly armed, properly trained armies when they were expected, let's say. But they were masters at, fighting and raiding and attacking a village or a town or a fortress or a burg, as they were called, when they were not expected. So they were very good at that. They were great raiders, and they terrorized all of Europe for centuries, actually, to the point that they were never able to kick them out at some point. And at some point, a huge part of Europe just became Daneland and Normandy, and the cultures just intermingled, and the Vikings just stayed there and mixed with the English that weren't called English yet, but the Britons and so on. So yes, I'm just sharing all of these to say that the idea of the Viking, the actual Viking, is a very complex idea. It's not a silly, dumb barbarian who likes to drink and who likes to fight, and that's all they do. They have a reason for fighting. They are looking for, again, resources, riches, and yes, often enough, glory in battle. Are the Space Wolves like that at all? No. No, not at all. The Space Wolves are more akin to dogs. I didn't get into like the fully how the Vikings are often work as mercenaries and bodyguards, actually. Even in the Byzantine Empire, some of the most fearsome bodyguards were the Varangian Guard, I believe. And actually the so-called last Viking king, Harald Hardrada, spent his younger years as an exile. He goes to Byzantine and becomes a Varangian Guard. But I digress. Now, the Space Wolves in Warhammer, they are nothing at all like that. They are just loyal. They are more like dogs than wolves. They don't feel like predators. They are basically just very reliable, very self-centered. Self-centered. I don't want to say self-centered, but like very obsessed with their own culture. And, they are always trying to fight for the Imperium, always friendly to the average Imperial citizen, and always rude to the average Imperial authority. Now, does any of that sound like actual Vikings? Like the history Vikings that I just described? No. So, how can you make the Space Wolves more interesting? How about you actually make them act like actual historical Vikings? How about, and this is where I wanna start tackling my full-on program on how to actually fix the Space Wolves in the lore, how about you make them the Space Marine version of a mercenary band? And let me take you back. This is my own universe of Warhammer. Let me take you back all the way to the Horus Heresy. The Space Wolves in the Horus Heresy made mistake after mistake. They basically did nothing right. They only made things worse for everyone else. And I can't, if I start naming all the mistakes, this video will be 4 years long. But basically they did the whole thing with Magnus and the Thousand Sons. They basically forced them to become traitors. They murked Magnus, at least temporarily. Then they got into a fight with people that they shouldn't have. Lyman Ross slapped my boy, my beautiful baby boy, Jagatai Khan. By the way, Jagatai, I think, means like baby or something like that. That's why I say baby boy. Jagatai Khan, who is the coolest Primarch, or at least one of the coolest Primarchs. And then they just pissed off to fight Horus and sacrificed most of their legion, and they abandoned Terra in their hour of need. Now, that's all good and well, but how do you actually begin fixing the Space Wolves? As soon as that happens, it becomes clear both to the Space Wolves, we're going all the way back to the Horus Heresy, it becomes clear both to the Space Wolves and to the new powers that be in Terra, be it the remaining Primarchs and the High Council of Terra, the High Lords of Terra, that the Space Wolves were never meant to be Space Marines. They were never meant to exist in society with their other Space Marine legions. They are not soldiers, they are savages, they are raiders, and it was futile to ever pretend that they weren't so. They are more interested in pursuing their own personal goals, their own personal glory. So what do? You have two options. Obviously, they're Lyman Ross and the Space Wolves, they are still loyal, right? And the new Imperium is devastated, so they can't afford to just dispense with, granted, a very battered Legion and a Primarch, but still a Legion and a Primarch. So they have two options. Either they make them excommunicado, not excommunicado traitores, mind you, so they're not traitors, they're just, they just send them away from the broader Imperium. They say like, okay, no, you can't exist here. You are way too wild. You are way too stupid, but let's be diplomatic. Your principles are way too different to ours, to the rest of the Imperium. However, the broader Imperium will not chase you down as traitors. We still have a use for barbarians, for psychopathic, self-centered barbarians like yourselves, with a culture of finding glory in battle, and a culture of being aggressive and not thinking things through. And so they make the Space Wolves sort of a renegade chapter, but with treatises that allow them to interact with the Imperium. So not really excommunicados. More so like I'm not thinking like the Ashen Claws. I'm thinking more like the Carcaro Astra, let's say. Whereas they are sent, we don't know much about the lore, but we know that at some point, probably prior to the Horus Heresy, or not long after, their entire chapter is sent to roam the void, to roam the deep void, and just get lost amongst the stars. But they are still considered a Space Marine chapter. They are still considered loyal. They just operate kind of in a gray area where they're not really part of the... Well, they are part, but they just they just have to stay on their own, basically, right? They have to roam the void, they have to roam the deep dark, the stars. And I would imagine something very much the same with the Space Wolves, but they don't say that. They just send them back to Fenris. They go, you know what, go back to Fenris. And you're a bunch of savages. We cannot trust you. But if you want to work, we'll pay you, basically. And they become mercenaries. Now, Lyman Ross, my new Lyman Ross, he is not loyal necessarily to the Emperor, because if he was, and to the Imperium and to the Dream of the Imperium, because if he was loyal, he wouldn't been so stupid. No, my Lyman Ross, he made all the decisions that he made, but he wasn't being stupid. He was just trying to be something that he's not. He's a barbarian king, and he realizes, you know what, yes, this whole Emperor's executioner kind of thing is not my thing. I am a barbarian, and I am a king, and you know, I thought my dad, the Emperor, was pretty cool and he was pretty strong, and that's why I followed him, but this whole being a commander is not my thing. So I will retreat back to Fenris, and I will do what I know how to do, what I learned to do here in Fenris. And I will take my warriors with me, and we will start raiding and pillaging. And who are we gonna raid? Whoever lets us raid them. Because, you know what? We like the idea of wolves. We are very much like wolves, and wolves are predators. So, and also they are scavengers. So whoever lets their guard down, we will raid them. Sometimes we will come as pirates. Sometimes we will approach the wider Imperium as traders. And if they want to pay for our services, they can give us, you know, technology. We can make a deal with the Mechanicum for technology, or some prime examples of gene seed when we need it, and weapons and things like that, or resources, you know, to feed the people in Fenris. And we will work for that. We will still be loyal to humanity, but, you know, if we want to raid at some point some far-off world in the Imperium, just because we need slaves, or because we need new people for our chapter, or new serfs for our chapter, or maybe they will just terrorize Fenris, I don't know. You know, but they are not morally good, because that is the thing about the Space Wolves in Warhammer 40,000 as they exist today. They are morally good. They literally break the universe lore, because they are the good guys. Take the Months of Shame, for example. Yes, it is a bit derpy that the Inquisition wants to murder a bunch of innocent people because they knew of the existence of the Grey Knights, or whatever it was. Like, I forget. I don't know, that the Months of Shame are kind of like dumb lore to me. But anyways, yes, it is a bit derpy, but they exist in that morally grey area. So, you know, it's warranted that something like that may happen, actually, in the Imperium. It's completely plausible. When the Space Wolves come and they're like, no, we will fight the Inquisition. Literally one of the strongest institutions in all of Warhammer. We will oppose them. Because this is wrong. Can you imagine an actual Viking doing that? No, we will fight. We will send our armies to fight, I don't know, the Church, the Vatican, or the Byzantine Empire, because they mistreated someone. No, they wouldn't do that, because the Vikings themselves mistreated people all the time. They killed the innocents all the time. And the Space Wolves, my Space Wolves, will do so too. They still consider themselves to be a net positive, and that is what they do. And mind you, this is not unprecedented. For example, the Carcardon Astra themselves, they also like to, they don't like, but they have to raid. It's part of their very old treatises, again, I think earlier than the Horus Heresy, if I'm not mistaken. They have these treatises that say that their chapter, they have the right to raid basically entire worlds for resources and slaves. So they are literal slavers, and the slaves, they use them for their chapter, as chapter serfs and as chapter initiates when they survive the brutal conditions of a Space Marine chapter, let's say. So that's all. There is a precedent in the lore for that. I would think that is a much cooler fate for the Space Wolves than what we have now, where they are actually morally grey, like Vikings. And they're like, hey, yes, we're loyal to the Imperium, but we also need resources to continue being loyal to the Imperium. And so if either the Imperium provides, or we have to go find those resources on our own. And maybe there are seasons where the Imperium needs, hey, we have to start a new crusade, so I need to purchase the services of a company of Space Wolves. Now these Space Wolves, they are constantly raiding, they are constantly at war, because they do have a culture of warfare. So they are highly skilled warriors, these Space Wolves, my new headcanon of the Space Wolves, right? They are highly skilled warriors, and so their services come at a high price. But perhaps not a full company of Space Wolves, perhaps just a few squads of Space Wolves. Perhaps just as bodyguards. You know, much like the Lucifer Blacks would be considered like an exotic bodyguard to have, you know? Perhaps a rogue trader, or a certain High Lord, or a certain what are they called? Like a high priest of the Ministorum, of the Ecclesiarchy, sorry. Maybe they want to have a Space Wolf bodyguard, or a squad of Space Wolves as their bodyguard, or a pack. You can call them. If you go along with this, I'll allow you, me with all the power that I have, I'll allow you to call yourselves packs. I'll allow you to snarl at each other if you go along with this. But there is something else, Space Wolves. If you want to keep your silly little snarls and your wolf fetishes, not fetishes, sorry, your wolf fetish, there is another thing that you have to do. You have to be cool with slavery. You have to be cool with ritualistic sacrifice of people and animals. Now, these don't have to be human. They can be Xenos. How cool and grimdark would it be to have a Space Wolf chapter or whatever? Yeah, I guess they are chapter. They're bigger than a chapter, but that has some enslaved orcs or Eldari with them. You know, basically using them as forced labor. Or as forcing them to fight in the front lines for them. I think that'd be cool. You know, they use them as cannon fodder. Or some Drukhari, you know. Because, again, they are still allies of humanity. So it'd be so cool if they could enslave the slavers. It'd be so badass. And that kind of like morally justifies the idea of allowing this entire chapter of maniacs to exist in the Imperium. Like, yes, we have an entire chapter of Viking maniacs who like to enslave things, but there's also an entire species out there, or a faction of a species, a subspecies of Drukhari out there that like to enslave humans and living things as well. So why don't we just fight monsters with monsters and just send them to fight each other? That is such a cool idea, I think. Again, if they were like actual Vikings. And what does the Inquisition do with this? Absolutely nothing. They're like, oh yeah, the Space Wolves, yeah, they sure do like to steal, you know, Drukhari artifacts and Xenos technology and all sorts of weird things. And they are very radical, but you know what? We won't take it against them because actually we pay them. Yes, that's right. The Inquisition, the Space Wolves will be mercenaries for the Inquisition. And so the Inquisition allows them to get away with so much stuff because the Inquisition often uses the Space Wolves. Now, the Space Wolves think themselves like, oh yes, the Inquisition are, they need us for our skills, and sure enough they do, but the Inquisition, they think like, okay, we're not gonna use our valuable resources, our specialist, highly elite chapters like the Death Watch, and more so the Grey Knights, in any sort of mission. We can also pay the Space Wolves as basically as hired muscle for things that don't require as much finesse. And these are brutes, these are animals, so we'll pay them to come and help us, to have basically a Space Marine chapter for hire. And that way we don't, you know, why the Space Wolves are taking the brunt on the brunt of the opposing army. We can send the Death Watch for precise strikes and objectives if it's against Xenos, or we can send the Grey Knights for, again, precise strikes and to take out specific high priority targets in case of, if it's a chaos threat, they can use the Grey Knight, sorry. That would be much cooler, because that is not the Imperium fighting against the idea of the Space Wolves, and not the Space Wolves fighting against the idea of the Imperium, but that is both of them acknowledging each other and acknowledging the strengths and weaknesses of each other. They don't have to like each other, they just have to be able to work together and to have a reason with allowing each other to exist, because as it stands, why haven't the Space Wolves, have they not been exterminados? The Dark Angels, Azrael, had the right idea when he was going to exterminados Fenris. Because he tried that at some point, I think. He had the right idea, honestly, the way things are with the Space Wolves. I don't even get me started with the Curse of the Wolfen, because this video is gonna be way too long. It has been way too long already. And I am gonna regret, I will for sure remember at some point all the things that I didn't mention, all the ideas that I've had for the Space Wolves that I didn't mention, but I can talk a bit more about what the beliefs of this new Space Wolf faction that I am creating on my head will be. If you wanna copy, you know, the Vikings with the beliefs of the Vikings, with a slight tinge of the Imperial Creed and the cult of the Emperor, you can still do that. You know, the All-Father can still be the Emperor, or was the All-Father Ross? I think the All-Father was the Emperor for the Space Wolves. So basically like Odin. And you can have Leman Ross in their culture be kind of like Thor. Or like, I don't know, just their father, basically. Their Primarch. Because again, well, let's just say they can have their own weird beliefs that are loosely based off of Viking traditions. Okay? Let's just say that. Nothing wrong with that. That makes for fun interactions whenever the ecclesiarchy hires them, because the ecclesiarchy is not supposed to have armies at their disposal, hired men at least, but hires them for their services. And it makes for fun interactions, much like in the past, the actual history, often Christian kings would have to hire Vikings for their services. And it made for fun cultural exchanges. You know, again, the Varangian Guard are an iconic, historic, elite force of warriors, of heavy infantry, shock troops, torturers, bodyguards, all sorts of things. They are extremely fearsome, and they were working for the Christian kings At points. I think at other points it was like Muslim leaders, or I forget my story in terms of the Byzantine Empire. I didn't read much about that, but I guess it depends on who the Byzantine Emperor was at the time, because there was a lot of cultural exchange in that period and in that area particularly. And I am not a smart person, don't be fooled by the wizard hat. But that's the idea. If you're actually gonna go after the whole Vikings trope, then actually make them more like Vikings. Now, their combat doctrines, yes, their combat doctrines, pun intended, they have to be a bit smarter than they are now. You can't just have your stupid, literally, the stupidest thing in the world. In the wolf time. I don't want this video to be so long. So maybe, should I leave it there? Yes, I should leave it there. I've already broken down one of the ideas on how to fix the space wolves. Let me know in the comments down below if you want to hear more about like other ideas that I have, because I have ideas, because that's just one way you can take them, like in the lore, to fix them. Again, this is only headcanon. I'm sure Games Workshop is not like Black Library, and all the writers at Black Library are not like listening to this and taking notes. I'm sure that's not happening. Neither should they, because I'm a horrible writer myself. I've tried. I'm terrible. But anyways, let me know. I have more ideas. You can take them more like the fantasy, dark fantasy, barbarian route. And I would love to see Space Wolves show up, much like the White Scars do, for example, with the heads of their slain enemies hanging from their belts and just drinking from their skulls. That'd be cool. That'd be a more dark fantasy version of the Viking trope. And you can have them be more animalistic if you want to go more like the wolf side. Less furry-like, but more actually animalistic, like, oh yeah, they are extremely unpredictable predators. They're very dangerous, they're very useful when they are fighting for the Imperium, but they are very unpredictable and very smart, because that's the thing that bothers me the most. They are unsophisticated animals in the lore. But anyways, I've yapped long enough. So, with that being said, share with me in the comments down below your own ideas and thoughts on how the Space Wolves are treated in the lore. And let me know if you would like to see another video in which I share more of my ideas on how to fix that or any other chapter or faction, because I am incredibly autistic and I think about these things a lot. So join the guard, hit subscribe if you want to be part of this love project of mine. If you want to check some of my art, I will leave a link in the description down below where you can go and see some of the stuff that I have worked in the past and I am currently working in. And with that being said, thanks for coming, thanks for watching. Ad Astra, and as always, remember, there are no female custodies.